Radiation and Project Orion. So let us look at what NASA is now saying about this radiation issue in context of the new Orion project. Note that Kelly Smith, the narrator, draws a diagram showing the path the spacecraft will take, which appears to be right through the Van Allen radiation belts on an equatorial trajectory. This route, he shows that the Van Allen radiation belt is important, as we will see later. He also makes this categorical statement concerning radiation.
We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
As might be expected, the skeptics have jumped all over this statement as some sort of admission by NASA that the Apollo missions never went to the moon. The point being made is that the Apollo missions supposedly solved this challenge 50 years ago and proved that radiation was not a problem, either going through the Van Allen radiation belts or traveling to and walking on the moon. So why is it suddenly seen as a problem for NASA and the Orion project? However, it is clear from our brief analysis of the subject that we cannot conclude whether it would be feasible for the astronauts to have survived the passage through the Van Allen radiation belts or whether NASA faked the moon landings. We need to look for other evidence of any NASA fakery. Historical records. At this point, I am obliged to give credit to Scott Henderson for much of the insights that will be discussed. Scott Henderson is a fervent Apollo moon hoax investigator who, through numerous hours of patient research, has uncovered many previously undetected anomalies in the Apollo story. So many thanks to Scott for providing me with some of the basis for what follows. You will recall that Dr. James Van Allen recommended a safer passage through the eponymous radiation belt would be to exit via the poles. In September 2014, Vintage Space, a website hosted by Amy Tietel, posted a video. In this video, she states that the Apollo missions threw right through the belts, but she does not show a diagram in which the path appears to miss the inner belt thought to be the most dangerous. Then, in 2017, we have two new posts, once again Amy Tietel, and the second from Curious Droid. Curious Droid is a website hosted by Paul Shalito, which is dedicated to investigating matters related to aerospace, space, robotics, transportation technology, and other similar technical subjects. Now, both these latter videos suggest that the Apollo missions took a northerly route when leaving the Earth and a southerly route when returning, so as to avoid the worst of the Van Allen radiation belts. I have researched in vain to find any NASA documentation of the supposedly polar trajectory to the moon taken by the Apollo missions. The first reference that I can find to the diagram shown by Curious Droid is in this NASA Space Math page 7 of unknown date, but first detected on the Wayback Machine on August 20th, 2008. For those who are unfamiliar with the Wayback Machine, it is a digital archive of the World Wide Web and other information on the Internet created by Internet Archive, a non-profit organization based in San Francisco, California, USA. It only randomly samples Internet sites, so it is not guaranteed to detect every site. The diagram that is shown is the Space Math paper, which was produced by scientists from the NASA Combined Release and Radiation Effects Satellites CRES, which was launched in 1990. This shows a schematic diagram of the Van Allen radiation belts, to which has been added the supposed route of the Apollo missions, which just about misses the inner radiation belt. The idea in the Space Math site was for students to calculate the amount of radiation that the astronauts would have received if they would have taken the route shown by the thick black line. Radiation levels were given for each of the colors. It is clear that this Space Math paper was the source of Curious Droid's diagram, as could be seen by comparing this diagram to snapshots taken from the Curious Droid video. He shows the suggested routes of the Apollo missions outbound to the moon and inbound back to Earth. I can only assume that Curious Droid added these routes, as I cannot find any other source. We also have a snapshot of the supposed Apollo missions path through the Van Allen belts from Amy Tietel's video. We have a further pro-NASA believer providing us with information on this translunar trajectory in 2009 by Robert Braenig. The figure above shows the Vintage Space website is taken from this Braenig paper. For some reason, this paper has now been deleted from the internet. So, according to the pro-NASA group, the Apollo missions took polar routes to avoid the worst of the Van Allen radiation belts. This is exactly what James Van Allen suggested. So, what is the problem? What is the problem? Well, I will now explain the problem. If we examine the original NASA documents from the 1960s, then we see no mention of the Apollo missions taking any polar route. In fact, quite the opposite. They all made the translunar burn and left the moon for a few degrees north or south of the equator, which would take them directly through the worst of the Van Allen radiation belts. Apollo 8 was the first manned mission to go to the moon, and therefore the astronauts were the first humans to traverse the Van Allen radiation belts. It is therefore pertinent to concentrate our investigation on this mission. Given that this was the first time man had traversed this most dangerous area of radiation, then surely the concerns of NASA would be reflected in the documentation produced at the time and the conversations that they had with astronauts during the mission. We can examine the NASA documents regarding the Apollo 8 mission and see what they said about the radiation risk, the path through the Van Allen radiation belt, and their conversations with the astronauts while and after they traversed this region. We have the following documents from the NASA archive. 1. Apollo 8 press release kit. 2. Apollo 8 flight plan volume 1. 3. Apollo 8 final flight evaluation report. 4. Apollo 8 flight transcripts. 5. Apollo 8 post-launch report. And 6. NASA translunar injection. Let us first examine the NASA press kit, which was released on 15 December 1968, just 6 days before the Apollo 8 launch. This press kit release shows clear diagrams of the orbit profile and the route to the moon. This document is unambiguous in that it shows the orbit profile as being over the Pacific Ocean, almost on the equatorial plane, for both outbound and inbound routes. This in stark contrast to the diagrams shown above by Vintage Space, Curious Droid, and Robert Breanig. Similarly, the Apollo 8 path to the moon is clearly close to the equatorial plane. Note that Breanig says in his deleted paper that this diagram should be disregarded as a not-to-scale drawing. It is not a matter of scale, but one of the Earth's orientation as clearly shown. Apollo 8 orbital profile. There is no mention of radiation in the flight plan of any polar route. The final flight evaluation report contains a list of 25 primary objectives and 12 secondary objectives. None of these objectives mention radiation measurements or any effect it may have on the astronauts. Similarly, there is nothing in the flight transcripts about the Van Allen belts or in the post-launch report. In addition, the NASA translunar injection figures show clearly that Apollo 8 enacted the translunar burn at altitude of 21.477, longitude minus 143.9242. From this latitude, a polar trajectory would be impossible. You will see similar latitudes and longitudes in this table for all Apollo missions that traverse the Van Allen radiation belts. Jara White also discusses this question of the supposed polar trajectory and also concludes that the northerly path would be impossible given the launch from Florida. The original NASA documentation is unequivocal. It was not until the early 2000s that the idea of Apollo 8 taking a polar route was first mentioned by the pro-NASA group, and one cannot help thinking that this was only a reaction to the skeptics doubting that a safe passage was possible through the Van Allen radiation belts, as it appears to have been fabricated a long time after the event, in fact, more than 30 years after. These facts clearly demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that NASA faked the Apollo moon landings and needed to amend the story when their first version of events was cast into doubt. It seems that suddenly somewhere between 2005 and 2014, we have a group of pro-NASA supporters spreading this story of a special polar routes, the NASA source of which I am unable to find. But perhaps the most obvious proof of fakery and the lies NASA have been telling comes from the voice transcripts recorded on the missions. Let me first set the scenario again. Apollo 8 was to be the first flight of humans beyond the protective cocoon of the Earth's magnetosphere. NASA knew from James Allen's research about the probable effects and the dangers of radiation to the astronauts as they passed through this region to reach the moon. So you may think Mission Control would be concerned about the health of the astronauts. Well, it seems not. There is nothing, absolutely nothing in the voice transcripts mentioning radiation or the Van Allen belts. It is totally implausible that Mission Control did not ask the astronauts how they were feeling during and after they passed through the Van Allen radiation belts. This should have been a crucial consideration in that any medical or biological effects could have seriously impaired the functioning of the astronauts. The fact that there is absolutely nothing concerning their successful transit through the Van Allen radiation belts in the voice transcripts is clear proof positive that they did not venture to the moon. It was only later, many years after the event, that NASA needed to invent special paths through the radiation belt due to the concerns being voiced by the skeptics relating to radiation exposure of the astronauts. It also appears that Dr. James Van Allen himself had modified his views on the radiation danger shortly before he died in 2006, as is being suggested by the posting from moontruth.org. This email allegedly is from James Van Allen, and it reads, "Dear Mr. Lambert, in reply to your email, I sent you the following copy of a response that I wrote to another inquiry about 2 months ago. The radiation belts of Earth do indeed pose important constraints to the safety of human spaceflight. The very energetic tens of hundreds of MeV protons in the inner radiation belt are the most dangerous and the most difficult to shield against, specifically prolonged flights, example, one of many months duration of humans or other animals in orbit about the Earth must be conducted at altitudes less than about 250 miles in order to avoid significant radiation exposure. A person in the cabin of a space shuttle in a circular equatorial orbit in the most intense region of the inner radiation belt at an altitude of about 100,000 miles would be subjected to a fatal dose of radiation in about 1 week. However, the outbound and inbound trajectories of the Apollo spacecraft cut through the outer portions of the inner radiation belt, and because of their high speed, spent only about 15 minutes in traversing this region and less than 2 hours in traversing the most less penetrating radiation in the outer region belt. However, the outbound and inbound trajectories of the Apollo spacecraft cut through the outer portions of the inner belt, and because of their high speed, spent only about 15 minutes in traversing this region and less than 2 hours in traversing the much less penetrating radiation in the outer radiation belt. The resulting radiation exposure for the round trip was less than 1% of a fatal dosage, a very minor risk among the far greater risks of such flights. I made such estimates in the early 1960s, and so informed NASA engineers who were planning the Apollo flights. These estimates are still reliable. The recent Fox TV show, which I saw, is an ingenious and entertaining assemblage of nonsense. The claim that radiation exposure during the Apollo missions would have been fatal to the astronauts is only one example of such nonsense. James Van Allen. The point being made by moontruth.org is that Dr. Van Allen never recanted his findings in a scientific paper, but only in an alleged email supposedly from him later in life. The fact is that scientists publish findings in journals, not in emails. The page goes on to suggest that Dr. Van Allen said that this nonsense is in an email, possibly under duress or threats. We do not know if the email was really from him or the NSA intercepting emails. He discovered a fatal radiation belt and then says it's nonsense? Nonsense? He never published any papers or article discounting his previous experiments or results. The Van Allen belt is a major obstacle to moon landings. He would have to speak against NASA and most Americans. He would need very strong internal fortitude. The quote above are the words of moontruth.org, not the authors. We can see more of NASA's flagrant disregard for the dangers of radiation on the astronauts from the Apollo 8 Final Flight Evaluation Report, April 1969. This report lists the 25 primary mission objectives and 12 secondary mission objectives. It is of interest to note that none of these objectives is related to radiation exposure or the astronaut survival. Everything is covered in the smallest detail, but nothing of radiation or the health of the astronauts. This is very revealing in that as the first trip of the astronauts through the Van Allen radiation belts, then the assessment of radiation exposure would be one of the primary or at least secondary objectives, but seemingly not. This is a further proof that NASA did not send astronauts through the Van Allen radiation belts, otherwise it would clearly or surely have been mentioned, particularly as they belatedly now say that the Apollo missions took a polar route. One more indication that the Apollo missions did not venture to the moon, as is revealed in Bart Sabrell's interview with Alan Bean. This is an extract from the moonmovie.com video entitled "No Way Out, Impassable Van Allen Belts and NASA Lies."
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No, now I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
Just to recap the role of astronaut Alan Bean, He was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 12, which supposedly landed on the moon on 19 November 1969. This video interview by Bart Sibrel is very revealing. Alan Bean initially stated that he was not sure Apollo 12 had gone far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belts on his way to the moon. Sibrel reminds him that the Van Allen belts start at about 100,000 miles out and extend to 25,000 miles out. Bean then states that he must have gone through them with no ill effects. Alan Bean further surprisingly states that he didn't think anyone knew about the radiation belts. Given the fact that NASA is now at pains to tell us that the Apollo missions took a special polar route to avoid the Van Allen radiation belts, then Alan Bean's answer is dumbfounding. As an astronaut on the Apollo missions, he should have been very well versed on the journey that they were about to take, so his lack of knowledge on the Van Allen radiation belts is totally implausible. Later in the interview, he comments on the shooting stars that the astronauts encountered on the shuttle mission when they were 365 miles above the Earth. He describes that they saw similar shooting stars on the Apollo 12 mission and states that they are cosmic rays hitting the back of the eye. Bean then contradicts himself totally when he says that they didn't see them on the Apollo 12 mission because they hadn't been discovered then, a totally unbelievable statement. He then goes on to recontradict himself again when he says that he saw these shooting stars whilst on the moon. The fact that an astronaut presumably fully trained for the Apollo 12 mission could be so ill-informed is totally implausible. It is just another example that NASA did not at the time pay much attention to the radiation hazards to the astronauts, as they did not, in reality, go to the moon. There can be no other plausible explanation. Apollo launch windows. Before we end this chapter, just a few more words on the trajectory business. The determination of launch windows is a complex task involving the motion of the Earth and the Moon around the Sun, as shown in the NASA video from 1967. It is not as simple as taking off whenever you choose, and in any direction you choose, like Flash Gordon. This question of the pro-NASA supporters belatedly suggests a polar trajectory is interesting is that it may not even be feasible. The main point to be made is that the translunar injection can only be made when it is in line with the antipode, so it cannot avoid the Van Allen belts, nor could any other path be taken because it would not connect to the Moon's path for the designated landing site without the addition of substantially more fuel and time. Similarly, this paper from the Apollo Flight Journal on the Apollo lunar landing launch windows states that there may be factors and constraints involved as described by Robert Wheeler. You can also view the discussion on the Collected Space Forum, which appears to state that the translunar burn to take the astronauts to the moon would have taken place over the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans. We can also examine the NASA Technical Report TND 780, Apollo Experience Report Protection Against Radiation, published in March 1973. This report discusses the radiation protection and specifically mentions the Van Allen radiation belts, but makes no mention of any polar route taken to minimize the radiation level experienced by the astronauts. This is implausible, as the paper is all about reducing the radiation risk for the astronauts. There is also a video by Jarrah White in which he states that the Apollo missions could not have taken any polar route. He notes that the Apollo missions were all launched from Florida. It would not have been possible for them to reach the polar regions in such a short amount of time and with the limited fuel available. It is only possible to orbit the whole planet, so that they would need to slowly adjust the orbital path to reach the northern trajectory. In fact, it would take several days to attain a polar orbit, and this they did not do. It is really beyond any reasonable doubt that NASA never sent any astronauts through the Van Allen radiation belt. It appears that it was not a great consideration at the time, as the public's knowledge of such scientific matters was very limited and something that they thought would never be a problem. Of course, NASA could not have anticipated the internet or the rise of public awareness of such matters, so they have needed after the event to fabricate cover stories to explain this omission. The historical documents demonstrates this beyond any reasonable doubts. Finally, we have this diagram taken from the NASA report HQ MA 68-7193 dated 30 October 1968 on page 14D. Note that the Apollo 8 was launched just 7 weeks later on 21st December 1968. This diagram is unequivocal in that it shows the translunar burn having taken place on the equator. Conclusions. The evidence that we have seen in this video so far amounts to convincing proof that NASA never sent any astronauts to the moon. In reality, it would appear that radiation was a detail in the fakery that was not covered well enough to avoid later detection. It is totally implausible that the radiation hazard was not all documented in the press release or the technical documents produced pre- and post-flight. Of particular importance is the evidence from the voice transcripts of the missions is that no mention is made of radiation, Van Allen belts, or the astronauts' health. This is so improbable if the moon missions were real and just appears to be an oversight by NASA in the construction of the fakery. The belated story that the Apollo missions took a polar route to avoid the worst of the Van Allen belts only appears to be in the early 2000s, presumably after much speculation from skeptics that the missions could not have passed through the Van Allen belts and the astronauts survived. This evidence shows that this route was not even possible due to a launch window constraint, not to mention the time and the fuel requirements. Such a route would have required considerable extra fuel and more time, but this is something that was never allowed for. Also, in the most total lack of knowledge about the Van Allen radiation belt shown by the Apollo 12 astronaut Alan Bean clearly shows that NASA never thoroughly briefed the astronauts on this matter. Without a doubt, they would have surely done this if the Apollo missions were really going to the moon and the astronauts' lives were in danger. You may be wondering why NASA would need to fabricate such a long story after the events. After all, they have published evidence to show that the radiation levels endured by Apollo astronauts were absolutely minimal and that no astronauts suffered any radiation illnesses later in life. So it may appear that NASA had the situation under control and that the fakery had been accepted. It may appear strange that prior to the Apollo missions, the Van Allen radiation belts were viewed as a potential hazardous danger, and NASA discussed protection against radiation, although they did little in that respect. Then, during the Apollo missions, it was shown that the astronauts suffered only minimal radiation effects equivalent to a simple X-ray. Now, in the Orion project, radiation is again seen by NASA as a major issue. So what happened? Did the Van Allen radiation belts disappear during the Apollo missions and now suddenly reappear? As NASA's next mission was to be to Mars, the radiation may well be a problem, as an X-ray a week for a minimum of 18 months journey would not be good for any astronaut. This is now all changed with President Trump's declaration that NASA must return to the moon, not Mars, by 2024. This may well reveal NASA's deceit, as going back to the moon may not be as easy as NASA made it look during the Apollo missions. Back then, it was no problem to send an astronaut to the moon in a thin aluminum box wearing a nylon suit, and they accomplished that in just 8 years, starting from virtually nothing. By 2024, the Orion project will have been in development for 20 years, starting with much more advanced technology, so the moon by 2024 should not be a problem for NASA. I suspect it will be more difficult to fake it this time, as every skeptic will be watching very closely. We will see in 4 years' time. It may well be that NASA already knows more than it has published about the radiation levels in the Van Allen radiation belts that could possibly demonstrate that it would have been impossible for humans to traverse these belts in the Apollo craft and survive. Conversely, it may be a pre-cover story just in case an impossibility was discovered in future that could clearly expose the fakery. In either case, NASA was not able to amend historical records which clearly and unambiguously show the near-equatorial translunar burn and trajectory for each of the Apollo missions. Instead, NASA cleverly devised the children's space math paper showing a new northerly route through the Van Allen belts without making any statement. The diagram shown was only produced after 1990 when the CREST satellite was launched. This fake story was embellished and subsequently propagated by the pro-NASA devotees. It is now assumed the false attribute of established fact and is repeated over and over by the pro-NASA group. It is often said that the first lie is the easiest, but subsequent lies to cover the first lie become increasingly more challenging. But let NASA have the last word on radiation outside low Earth orbit for now. In a BBC Newsnight interview with NASA Chief Scientist Dr. Ellen Stofan, who is the principal advisor to the NASA administrator, aired in November 2014, she said, "NASA's focus now is on sending humans beyond low Earth orbit to Mars. We are trying to develop the technologies to get there. It is actually a huge technological challenge. There are a couple of really big issues. For one thing, radiation. Once you get outside the Earth's magnetic field, we are going to be exposing the astronauts to not just radiation coming from the sun, but also to cosmic radiation. That's a higher dose than we think humans right now should really get. This is a very revealing statement in several ways. NASA is undoubtedly the one organization in the world who should have extensive information on the radiation levels outside Earth's protective magnetosphere. Not only have they sent numerous unmanned probes through this region, which presumably had radiation detectors on board, but they also claim that they sent 27 Apollo astronauts outside Earth's protective magnetosphere. According to the NASA data, the radiation effects on these astronauts were minimal, less than my annual CT scan, so one has to ponder why now it is seen as a really big issue. NASA now tell us about the difficulties of providing radiation protection to the astronauts, but the obvious question is, did they do this for the Apollo missions? I think the only conclusion one could make is that the Apollo astronauts never traveled outside Earth's magnetosphere, and now NASA are faced with the problem of supposedly repeating the missions to the moon without killing the astronauts. I am personally very doubtful that humans could travel into space with the present technology.